The last camp of the Donner Party remains one of the most haunting images in the story of the American West. A group of families, trapped by an early snow, starving in the shadow of a mountain pass they never reached. The image is so vivid, so overwhelming, that it has become almost all we remember of them. But it shouldn't be. No group of people can be understood through their worst months alone. Tonight, we'll trace the Donner Party through its entire journey, from the ordinary lives they left behind in Illinois and Iowa, through the long summer crossing of the plains, through the decision that would cost them everything, and into the mountains where their story became legend. We'll experience the winter not simply as an ending, but as the point where their courage, their conflict, and their humanity were tested more completely than almost any other group in the history of westward expansion. And we'll see how their story was carried forward afterward, shaping the trails, the laws, and the warnings given to every wagon train that followed. Before we begin, a brief word. My name is Faisal, and I'm the person behind this channel. Each of these stories takes weeks of research and careful work to bring to life, because I believe these people deserve to be remembered accurately, not just as a cautionary tale. If you find yourself drawn into this story tonight, I'd be genuinely grateful if you considered subscribing, and if anything in this journey stays with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's begin. Springfield, Illinois, the spring of 1846. Two families were preparing to do something that tens of thousands of Americans were beginning to consider: leave everything they knew and travel west. George Donner was 60 years old, a prosperous farmer, married to his third wife, Tamsen, a schoolteacher with a sharp mind and a habit of writing letters that captured the mood of the journey better than almost anyone else who made it. His brother Jacob traveled with him, along with Jacob's own large family. Together with the family of James Frazier Reed, a furniture merchant and one of the wealthier members of the group, they formed the core of what would become known as the Donner Party. They were not poor. This is worth pausing on because it complicates the story people tell. These were not desperate families fleeing ruin. They were middle class, even comfortable, drawn west by the same restless promise that pulled so many Americans in this decade: cheap land, a warmer climate, and the sense that California and Oregon represented a kind of second chance the crowded East could no longer offer. Reed in particular traveled in extraordinary comfort, with a custom-built two-story wagon that included a stove and spring-mounted seats. It was, by the standards of the trail, almost absurdly indulgent. It would later become a symbol of everything that slowed them down. They set out in April, joining a larger wagon train heading toward Independence, Missouri, the traditional jumping-off point for the Oregon and California trails. For the first months, their journey looked like countless others: long days of walking beside the wagons, the rhythm of making and breaking camp, river crossings that could take a full day to organize, children who grew leaner and browner under the sun. It was hard, but it was familiar hard, the kind of hardship thousands of trail diaries describe in almost identical language. The trouble began with a book. Lansford Hastings, a lawyer and promoter with grand ambitions for California's future, had published a guide claiming there was a shortcut. Instead of following the well-worn trail north to Fort Hall and then curving down into California, wagon trains could cut almost directly west, he claimed, saving as much as 350 miles. He called it the Hastings Cutoff. He had never actually taken it with a wagon train himself. He had ridden it on horseback, a very different undertaking, and even then, only once. At the Little Sandy River in Wyoming, the larger wagon train reached a fork in the trail, and here the group that would become the Donner Party made its decision. Against the advice of experienced guides, against the warnings of men who had made the crossing before, 87 people in 23 wagons turned south, following Hastings's promised shortcut. It would have been an unremarkable decision if it had worked. Instead, it became the single choice historians point to as the beginning of everything that followed. The Wasatch Mountains destroyed any advantage the shortcut might have offered. Hastings's route required cutting a road through dense canyon brush and rock that no wagon had ever crossed. The party spent nearly 3 weeks hacking their way through terrain that should have taken days, exhausting themselves, their animals, and their patience in the process. Tamsen Donner's letters from this stretch show a woman trying to stay optimistic while watching the calendar slip away beneath her. Every day lost in the Wasatch was a day they would not have in the Sierra Nevada when it mattered most. Then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert, 80 miles of cracked salt flats with no reliable water, was supposed to take 2 days according to Hastings's guide. It took the party nearly 6. Oxen died of thirst and exhaustion. Wagons were abandoned in the salt flats, their owners forced to consolidate what remained onto fewer vehicles and continue on foot beside them. James Reed lost most of his own oxen here, the animals wandering off in a maddened search for water and never being recovered. The custom wagon that had once been the envy of the train was left behind, its owner walking now like everyone else. By the time they rejoined the main California trail near the Humboldt River in Nevada, they had lost weeks they could never get back, and they had lost something else too. The desert and the mountains had frayed the group's cohesion. Long marches through starvation-adjacent conditions have a way of turning strangers, and even friends, against each other, and by early October tempers were raw in a way they had not been at the start of the journey. It was here that violence entered the story directly. An argument between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder over a stalled wagon and a whip used too freely ended with Snyder dead, stabbed by Reed in the chaos of the confrontation. The party, exhausted and frightened, made the decision to banish Reed from the group entirely, sending him ahead on horseback without his family, into territory he did not know, in conditions that should have killed him. It did not. Reed would survive, reaching Sutter's Fort in California weeks later, and it would be Reed, of all people, who helped organize the earliest rescue efforts once word of the party's fate reached the settlements. But for now, his wife and children continued west without him, one more strain added to a group that was already coming apart at the seams. By late October, the party had reached the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, the final mountain range standing between them and the Sacramento Valley. In an ordinary year, this crossing might have taken a week. They were exhausted, low on food, traveling with weakened animals, and dangerously behind schedule. And then, on the 28th of October, snow began to fall. It was early, even by Sierra standards, where the first storms can arrive in November. This was early, and it did not stop. Within days, snow was blocking the pass they needed to cross, the one that would later be named for the family it trapped. The party made camp where they could, some at a lake near the base of the mountains, soon to be called Donner Lake, others several miles away at a creek called Alder Creek, where the Donner families themselves had fallen behind the main group and were now cut off from even the limited shelter the others had found. What followed was 4 months of the worst winter conditions on record for that stretch of mountains. Snow fell in feet, not inches. Cabins built from earlier emigrant parties offered some shelter at the lake camp, but at Alder Creek, the Donner families had only makeshift tents and lean-tos, exposed to storms that buried structures meant for far milder conditions. Food, already scarce, ran out entirely within weeks. The oxen were slaughtered and eaten. Then the hides of the oxen were boiled for whatever nutrition remained in the leather. Then came the things that should not need to be eaten at all: bark, twigs, the leather of shoes and harnesses. By December, people were beginning to die. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way starvation and cold work on a body when there is no more reserve left to draw on. Children died first, more often than not, their smaller frames unable to withstand what the adults barely could endure a little longer. And here the story reaches the point most people already know, even if they know almost nothing else about the Donner Party. With no food remaining and no rescue in sight, some of the survivors began to eat the bodies of those who had already died. It is worth sitting with this carefully, rather than rushing past it or dwelling on it for shock. What happened at Donner Lake and Alder Creek was not moral collapse. It was the last stage of starvation, a biological reality that has appeared in nearly every well-documented famine and survival situation in human history, from shipwrecks to sieges to Arctic expeditions. The people who made this choice did so only after every other option had been exhausted, and many of them carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Tamsen Donner, by most accounts, refused to leave her dying husband's side, even when a rescue party offered to take her to safety without him, and she did not survive the winter. Her fate remains one of the more quietly devastating threads in the entire story. The first rescue party, later called the Forlorn Hope, was not sent by outsiders. It was formed by members of the group themselves, 15 of the strongest survivors, mostly men but including several women, who set out on improvised snowshoes in mid-December to try to reach the settlements and bring help back before it was too late. It took them 33 days. More than half of them did not survive the crossing. Those who did stumbled into a Native American village on the western slope of the mountains, in a state so reduced that the people there, who had every reason to be wary of these strange, desperate travelers, instead fed them and helped guide them the rest of the way to safety. Word reached Sutter's Fort and the small California settlements in late January, and from there, a series of relief efforts began, organized in part by James Reed, who had reached California weeks earlier and had spent the winter unable to do anything but wait and plan for the moment rescue might become possible. 4 separate relief parties made the dangerous crossing back into the mountains between February and April of 1847, each one battling the same snow and cold that had trapped the original party, each one carrying out as many survivors as they could manage, and in some tragic cases, having to leave behind those too weak to travel, with promises to return that could not always be kept in time. Of the 87 people who had turned south at the Little Sandy River 7 months earlier, 48 survived. It is a number that sits uneasily in the middle, not the near-total loss that popular memory sometimes imagines, but not anything close to safety either. More than half made it through. Nearly half did not. And the ones who lived carried the experience for the rest of their lives, in ways that ranged from lasting trauma to, in a handful of cases, a strange kind of resilience that shaped everything they did afterward. Word of what had happened spread quickly through California and back east, and the story took on a life of its own almost immediately. Newspapers seized on the more sensational details. The name Donner Party became shorthand for disaster, for the dangers of the overland trail, for what could happen when ambition outran preparation. Lansford Hastings, whose cutoff had cost the party the weeks that ultimately proved fatal, faded from public prominence, his promised shortcut becoming, in hindsight, one of the most consequential bad decisions in the history of American westward migration. But the story did not end with tragedy. It became, almost immediately, a kind of cautionary knowledge passed down the trail. Later wagon trains studied the Donner Party's mistakes specifically, the danger of unproven shortcuts, the necessity of crossing the Sierra Nevada before the first snows, the importance of group cohesion under pressure. In a real sense, the deaths at Donner Lake and Alder Creek made the trails that followed safer, because they gave every subsequent emigrant party a hard, specific lesson in exactly what could go wrong and exactly when. Today, the site of their winter camp is preserved as Donner Memorial State Park, near what is now the town of Truckee, California. A monument stands at the height the snow reached that winter, a detail that stops most visitors cold when they first read it. The platform is built at the level the snowpack rose to, nearly 22 feet above the ground where the survivors' cabins once stood. Donner Pass and Donner Lake carry the family's name permanently into the map of California, a quiet, almost neutral kind of memorial for an event that was anything but quiet when it happened. We began tonight with the image most people already carry of the Donner Party, the snowbound camp, the desperation, the choices no one should ever have to make. But that image on its own does them a disservice. They were, before any of that, ordinary families chasing an ordinary dream, one shared by tens of thousands of their contemporaries. Their story became extraordinary not because of who they were, but because of a shortcut that didn't exist, a season that arrived 3 weeks early, and a mountain range that does not forgive lost time. What survives of them now is not just a warning. It is a record of how far people can be pushed, and how many of them, even at the very end, held onto their humanity anyway. Further reading. Desperate Passage, The Donner Party's Perilous Journey West, 2009, Ethan Rarick. A thorough and well-researched account that traces the full journey and its aftermath in careful detail. The Best Land Under Heaven, The Donner Party in the Age of Manifest Destiny, 2008, Michael Wallis. Places the party's story within the broader context of westward expansion and the political forces driving it. Ordeal by Hunger, The Story of the Donner Party, 1936, revised 1960, George R. Stewart. The classic early account, still widely cited, drawing heavily on survivor testimony and letters. The Donner Party Chronicles, a day-by-day account of a doomed wagon train, 1997, Frank Mullen, Jr. A detailed chronological reconstruction useful for readers who want to follow the timeline precisely.